Hello everyone, my name is Rudo Chifamba and welcome to my YouTube channel where I talk all things projects. Today I'm going to start the video a lot differently than how I normally would because it's April and the month of April is Autism Acceptance Month. It actually used to be Autism Awareness Month, but as of 2022, it is going to be Autism Acceptance Month. And this is a cause that's really close to my heart, and so I felt like I wanted to give a moment to just recognize Autism Acceptance Month, because there's so many people that are touched by autism in this world, whether it be that somebody is on the autism spectrum themselves or that they have a loved one or a friend that is on the autism spectrum. So the more that each and every one of us can do to educate ourselves about autism and to create a world that is more accepting of those on the spectrum, we actually do a lot in empowering autistic individuals, allowing them to thrive and reach their full potential. So that's that bit about autism. I am going to be putting links down below in this video to some useful autism resources if you are interested and want to read around the subject a little bit more. And throughout the month of April, I'm going to be spotlighting or showcasing the autism awareness symbol somewhere on the video, whether top left corner or top right corner. I always get left and right wrong, so it would be somewhere on the video, and in just recognition of Autism Acceptance Month. Right, so we can now get into the business of today's video. Today we're going to be talking methodology in terms of project management methodology. And I'm going to pose a rather contentious question. So I think it is. You would be the judge of whether the question itself is contentious. So really the topic of today is Waterfall methodology versus Agile methodology. Is one better than the other? All right. And in order to be able to answer that question, what I would actually like to do is first of all define what a methodology is, just very quickly, so that we understand, we have a common understanding. And then I'd like to break down each one of those two methodologies so that I can get to a point where I can actually start to answer the question. So simplistic definition, let me not call it simplistic. The definition of methodology according to the Oxford Dictionary is it is a set of methods that are used in an area of study or an activity. Right, so if we plug in project management there, it would mean that project management methodology is a set of methods that are used in the area of project management. That actually plugged in really nicely, right? So that's how methodology defined there. And then defining waterfall and agile methodologies themselves. Now, before I dive into kind of doing a breakdown, I just want to be upfront in saying that the treatment that I'm going to give of each of the methodologies is not going to be an in-depth treatment, just because I've got a very limited time space in which to do that, right? So I'm doing this for the purists out there. If you're like, oh, but that is not quite it, or you didn't go into much depth, I just want to get to give the gist of what each methodology is about and give enough detail and material such that I can do a decent job of answering the question at hand, right? Okay, so that's that bit out of the way. Now we'll start with breaking down the waterfall methodology because it showed up first, right? It's the older methodology. And waterfall, I'll break down some key characteristics of waterfall that help, that are relevant to the context of this discussion. So the first most significant characteristic of waterfall is that it comprises a cascading set of phases that are executed in linear fashion, and each phase is not executed until the preceding phase has been executed. There are very clean handoffs between one phase and the next. So let me bring that into a little bit of real life and put some description around the different phases. You're running a project generically, you would do requirements gathering, that's the requirements gathering phase. Then you would get into the planning and design phase. Then you would get into the build phase, where you're actually building the project product. Then you would get into the testing phase, where you are testing the product that you have built. And then once you test it and it tests okay, you deploy, you get into the deployment phase. And then after the deployment phase, you've got the support and maintenance phase. Now, that's not the full gamut of the support and maintenance phases in the operation or the product life cycle, but just that piece of the support and maintenance phase where you're handing over from the project to the operating team. Right, so that's one characteristic, one key characteristic of Waterfall. The other characteristic of Waterfall is it is characterized by following a very strict plan. And I'll go back to one of the phases that I kind of touched on, which is the planning and design phase. Within that phase, the project team actually really goes in depth into planning out the project itself, as well as the design of the project. And this plan, really what comes out of that phase is the detailed project plan. Now, a lot of people so what comes out of it is the project schedule. You will have a human resources plan. You will have your risk plan. A lot of people refer to the project schedule colloquially as the project plan, but it's really part of the project plan. So you have your schedule, you have a human resources plan, you've got a risk management plan, you've got a project procurement plan. If it's in manufacturing, for example, any project really, you can also have a project quality plan, quality management plan. So you come out of this with these thick volumes of plans, and that is really the playbook to which the project is managed. So as the project is now executed, the project team is strictly stepping through that plan. Inherent in that, therefore, it brings us to the third characteristic of Waterfall, which is that it is a rather inflexible methodology when it comes to change. Because you're following that strict plan and everything, in order to implement change, you have to go through a rather formal process of, change management. You decide, oh, we want to change this bit. You go to the change control board, you present your change is reviewed, and then once your change is approved, you probably have a ricocheting effect or on other plans, other related plans that have to be changed because of the change that you implemented in one area. So really, Waterfall, really rather inflexible, rather clunky if you want to make changes on the fly. The fourth characteristic of Waterfall that is relevant for this discussion is that because you're executing in series, the only time that you actually ever really touch and feel a real product is right at the end of the project, in that deploy phase. You might get a glimpse of it in the design phase where the project team designs the product. You can get a sense of how things are going in terms of building that product throughout the build phase, through project status reports. And if you're a super inquisitive customer, maybe you'll be able to start seeing the product in the test phase. But really, for most intents and purposes, and in most instances, you really see the product at the deploy phase. So if this is a 2-year project, for example, it will take you 2 years before you see the product that you envisaged 2 years prior. And another thing that I'd like to highlight, and I'll use an analogy here because I want to use that very same analogy when I do the same treatment of the Agile methodology, is if you hypothetically had a project product which was to build a product with 10 features. In Waterfall, what would happen is the planning of how those 10 features are going to be delivered would happen in the planning phase. The design thereof would also happen in that planning and design phase. When you move into the build phase, you are building all of those 10 features within that phase, and you don't move to the next phase, which is the testing phase, until you've actually completed the build of those 10 features. When you move into the testing phase, you're moving with all 10 features into the testing phase. You test them. until they all check out as working. You move them all then into the deploy phase, and that's where you've got a real life product. So it takes a while from, when you envision the project to when you actually see it. So those are the 4 characteristics I wanted to highlight about Waterfall. And then now I'll move on to do the same treatment for the Agile methodology. Now onto the newer kid on the block, and that's Agile. The key characteristics of Agile that I want to highlight, and primarily the first one, would be that Agile is an iterative methodology, right? Whilst Waterfall is sequential, Agile comprises iterative cycles of kind of similar to what we talked about in Waterfall, where you do your requirements gathering, you plan, you build, you test, and you deploy. But you have multiple of those cycles within an Agile product. And ideally, with each one of those cycles, when you actually do a deployment, you are deploying what they call a potentially shippable, really in simple terms, a potentially usable piece of functionality, whether it be a software, whether it be a product, whatever it is that you're building, right? So that's Agile, iterative cycles, multiple of those within a project. And another characteristic of Agile is that within those iterative cycles, they're characterized by high levels of collaboration, especially compared to Waterfall. And that's collaboration within the project team itself, as well as collaboration between the project team and the customer. So there's constant engagement, there's getting feedback. The project team builds something, they show it to the customer gives feedback, adjustments are made if necessary, and the project goes on like that. So heightened communication is another characteristic of Agile. Another important characteristic of Agile is that Agile is very flexible. We talked about the waterfall ship being very clunky and much more difficult to turn, or not as easy to turn. With Agile, the methodology is inherent in how it is very flexible. So I'll go and pick up that analogy that I started with Waterfall of the project product that has got 10 features. With Waterfall, instead of building all of those features and delivering at the same time and delivering them all at the same time, with Waterfall, with Agile, you can actually break those features down. So you can say feature 1 to feature 10, and then for each one of those features, you can have a cycle dedicated to just building out that feature and deploying out, building out the next feature and deploying it. And again, it's simplistic. You could have multiple combinations, like sets of features, however. But for this example, we'll just call it like a cycle per feature. And the flexibility of Agile then comes in the sense that if, for example, you've got features being delivered 1 to 10 in that order, and then the customer comes back and they say, oh, no, we've changed our minds, or our priorities have changed, and we actually want features number 9 and 10 to be delivered right after features number 1 and 2, and then just go and bump down features 3 and 4 all the way to where 9 and 10 were. It's very easy to do that because you've broken the project down into bite-sized chunks, so making those changes is not onerous. That's another feature of Agile. Then the very last feature of Agile that I want to highlight, and I've already talked to it, but I want to emphasize it. With Waterfall, where you get your final product right at the end is when you can eyeball it and you can touch and feel it. With Agile, you can actually get components of your final product being delivered on a regular basis all the way throughout the project. And you can determine at what frequency you want to be getting those features out. But definitely it will be a lot higher frequency than with the Waterfall counterpart, right? So broken down both methodologies, and now the next port of call, I suppose, is to answer the question, Waterfall on this side, Agile on this side, is one better than the other? Okay, so let's answer that question, right? Is either methodology better than the other, right? Maybe a drum roll. I wish I'd actually brought a little drum or something for the drum roll, but anyway, right, let me get serious. Waterfall, Agile, Agile, Waterfall, Waterfall, Agile. Really, the bottom line, guys, is neither methodology is better than the other. It really depends on your project scenario, right? Some projects are better suited for waterfall execution, and some projects are better suited for agile. And I'll do a brief outline of which projects are better suited to which methodology. So on the waterfall side, if you have a very clear vision of what you want to build, and you have a clear vision of how to get there. And by very clear, I don't mean you have to know everything 100%, because that's not real life. No one ever knows 100%. But you have a high confidence level of what it is you want to build and how to get there. So you're very clear on the what and you're very clear on the how. Then waterfall is a good candidate for that. Another scenario where waterfall would be a good candidate, and it's probably a derivative of that scenario that I've just described, is if you have executed your project before, and ideally you've executed it more than once, and you're really comfortable in knowing the what and the how, then waterfall is a good candidate. And let me give a real life example of this. So you've implemented this project in 3 other cities before. So it's exactly the same product, maybe slight deviations, but nothing material. And all you're changing is the locale. You want to now implement this project in a 4th city. You can very well use waterfall for that. And it doesn't matter that in the prior implementations you might have used agile, because maybe in the first or maybe the first 2 instances you were still in discovery mode, you were not really sure. Then when you've got things down pat, now you've got your assets, you've got your project plans, you can just dust them off, tweak them for your particular scenario and use them for this new project. So then it will be a big check mark against waterfall, because in that instance it wouldn't really serve you well to use agile, because right, like even the customer interactions, building things in cycles and all of that, it might not really serve you that well. It might actually really be more of a tax than giving you value in your actual endeavor at that moment. Then the last scenario in which waterfall would be a good fit, and I say this with multiple disclaimers, invisible disclaimers around this, so take it with a pinch of salt, because I don't know if there are many real life situations where this would be applicable, but there probably would be, right? So if your product does not benefit necessarily from being built in multiple deliveries, your customer is not really expecting deliveries across the life cycle of the project, and if your project is such that once you get your initial brief from your client and you do a design and all of that, you're not really necessarily needing to interact with them back and forth that much, then your project is probably a good candidate for waterfall. And examples that come to mind might be like building construction, for example. But like I said, take it with a pinch of salt, run it through the litmus test, and if it passes, you use waterfall. If it doesn't, then probably agile is a better candidate for you. Now, going on to the agile side, I probably kind of like already talked to the inverse of what is applicable for waterfall is what is applicable for agile. If you don't have a clear vision of what it is you are building and how it is you're going to build it, then agile is a good candidate in that instance. And actually in real life, a lot of agile teams find out that what it is that they envisioned with their customer at the beginning of the project and what it is that they sort of envisioned, right? Because we said you don't know it for sure. And what it is they actually ended up with were vastly different, slightly different. It's a spectrum, but they were definitely different. So they started off here, wanting to go here, and they actually ended up here. And they were actually happier with here than there, so you actually end up with a more superior outcome here because you had the opportunity to do discovery and experimentation, and you were tightly coupled in your communication in determining what good looked like. That's in one instance where Agile would be very useful. The next instance would be if you have that situation where your customer would like to have regular deliveries of usable functionality throughout the entire life cycle of the project, as opposed to the big bang approach, which is what you get with Waterfall. Then in that instance, Agile is a good candidate. So there's the answer. The long and short of it is fitness of purpose. You use the right tool for the project at hand. And having said that, as a parting shot, the last nugget of wisdom that I'd like to leave you guys with is, in real life, it's never really about either or, right? Like, I'm going to use Waterfall and it's purely Waterfall. I'm going to use Agile and it's purely Agile. You'll always benefit from, even if you're largely using Waterfall, going and picking elements of Agile that are applicable to that project or that actually enhance the execution of your project and use them. And likewise, you could be executing mostly Agile. You go and pick up elements of Waterfall that enhance the execution of your project. You could go with kind of like an even balance. Whatever it is that works for your project, whatever it is that sets your project up for success is what you should do. This therefore means that the methodology selection, as you're starting your project in the initiating phase, the effort and focus that you put into methodology selection is crucial. Because if you pick the wrong methodology, then you're setting yourself up for a lot of pain downstream. You are waterfalling a project that's ideal for Agile, lots of pain. You're agiling a project that is ideal for Waterfall, probably lots of unnecessary overhead there. So think very closely about this, pay close attention to it, make the investment that's needed to do upfront. On that note, I'm going to end here. And again, if you liked this video, please hit the like button. And if you find the content that I share on this channel useful, please hit the subscribe button. That way you get notified each time I put out a new video. And until next video, you all take care. Bye.